Okay, let's look at the last video for Module 10 on how to configure the default gateway. Now remember, the default gateway tells me when either your PC or a router doesn't know how to get to a network. You need to make sure that I have somebody in your network that knows how to get to the next person that may know. So if you're looking at, when you're setting up a default gateway, what are you doing? I am setting up a default gateway on my host, on my PC. You'll set up that. Now, what is the default gateway? Well, the default gateway ends up being the IP address of the interface of what it could be. So in this case, you've got what? IP, it's 192.168.10.1 would be the interface for that network. Because remember, each one of these interfaces on a router is a different network. So they are on two, if you look at you've got 192.168.10, 192.168.11, two separate networks. So each interface on a router identifies a different network. Now, if I'm getting to between those networks, the only way I can communicate between two networks is through a router. If I'm doing things within my network, the switch does fine. It knows who connected the switch, which MAC address is there, which interface are on, and I can make that transition very quickly and leave the router altogether. The second I've got to go to another network, even if it's connected to the same router, I've got to go through the router to make that path. So as you see in this picture here, to get to PC1 to PC3, two totally separate networks, but I have to go through the router. So same thing happens with setting up, in an IPv6, it's just how you set up the address. Now, if I'm setting up a default gateway on the switch, so the default gateway says, typically a switch is just a layer 2 device and it really doesn't need an IP address to function properly. But if I want to remote access into the switch, I need an IP address. If this could be a layer 3 switch, so then I would need an IP address. But on a switch, to configure the default gateway, there's a command, use IP default gateway. And then what do you got to do? You got to give it an IP address and a password. Well, you got to give it at least the IP address. So usually what happens is I give an IP address, I assign an IP address to the VLAN, because that's the administrative way to get in to the switch. So the outside world needs to know what the address is. And then it's got to say, what is the default gateway? Who knows the way to get out of the switch? So the switch has got to know, hey, you're doing some work, I got to send data back. I need to understand what that address is. And to set that default gateway, it is used the IP default gateway and then give it an IP address. Now, on the switch, that's the easiest way to do. I'll let you play games with it on the switch. But now on a LAN, this is the lab I think you're going to do is here. I want you to connect a router to a LAN, and you're going to use various show commands to kind of display the current state of your router and go from there. Now, I did not assign the troubleshooting gateway issues. I probably could have and probably should have, but we've got enough on our plate this chapter that if you want to look at it and play with it, I highly recommend it, because usually forgetting to put a default gateway or way out of a host or out of a router ends up being one of the problems you run into the most issues with. So I didn't assign it to you, but highly recommend you try it. So hopefully that helped. And if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.